We don't talk about it much, but we are living in a marketplace of supposed wisdom. That is memes, quotations, books, the comments that people post on Facebook and social media. A lot of it is driven by an attempt to provide some wisdom. So the question becomes, how do you shop among these supposedly wise interpretations? People have come to my website and think that they've found something wise. And the question I want to ask is, how do you know if you're actually getting some wisdom or getting some bullshit? Maybe bullshit that's beautifully dressed up in a fine font or supposedly a quotation from someone important and smart, or maybe flowery prose, something like that. How would you know? How would you know whether it's actually wisdom or stuff masquerading as wisdom that isn't actually wisdom? Matters to me a lot. My PhD is in basically how do you shop among interpretation? What counts as wisdom is basically what my work has been about for about 30 years. Now, one thing I like to do when I'm shopping, I'm assaying. To assay a mineral, a mine, for example, would be to figure out what value there is in it. To make an assay of wisdom, I start out by stripping the name off of it and seeing whether the thing makes any sense by itself. Something that I dish out, for example. I send you something, put something up on YouTube. How would you know whether it's worthy of your attention? Okay, so I strip the name off of it. I don't give a fuck who said the thing. The question is whether the thing has any content that's worthwhile. The other thing I do to kick the tires on it is I remove the flowery language and font and all of that and just think about what it actually means, the content by itself. Another thing I do is I rebrand it to my opponents. So if I find something about living in the moment and being proud and not tolerating haters, I'll put it under the MAGA logo. I'll imagine what it would be like if my rivals were saying that, and it usually will bring up some contradiction in my mind about it. And that's what I'm after, because actually I live in the world of paired opposites. I'm interested in opposite extremes and finding my way. To me, wisdom is knowing the differences that make a difference to whether I should do one thing or its opposite. It's like the serenity prayer, courage to change, the serenity to accept. Those are opposites, which is why you need the wisdom. So I'm very drawn to that approach to considering the value of wisdom. What often is sold as wisdom, as the whole truth, is a half truth, posturing as if it's the whole truth. So another thing I like to do when let's say I'm evaluating a meme, is I look for counterexamples. That is, if it says you should always do X, I look for exceptions. If I find even one exception, then it proves it's not an always do X kind of thing. Okay. Now, I do end up paying attention to the source of wisdom, but not for the, wow, this is a $10 person, therefore must be wise kind of approach. I want to understand where this person is coming from, what their core assumptions are. Where do they ground their wisdom? And this is a real important issue for me, is because I would say across the spectrum, whether it's religious, spiritual, philosophic, or science, the way it tends to get done is that it's grounded in abstraction that are simply declared. For example, the most obvious examples would be religion or spiritual, which is you simply posit the existence of a soul or posit the existence of God or a vital force. And yet, I would argue that even in the sciences, we do still posit that we have a soul. We give it more credible or sober sounding names. We're not trying to sound like poets when we're working in science. But if I said you have agency or interiority, or that there's something teleological about you, or if I said that you are a organism struggling for your own existence, all of that implies that you either are or have something called a soul. My approach is different. I don't get to just declare these abstractions, like that I have a soul. I do believe I have one, but I have to explain it. I have to explain the existence of a soul from what precedes it. And that's not something you actually get from many scientists. For example, in biology and the social sciences, the general assumption is that life is different from physics and chemistry. There are the hard sciences, and then there's the soft science. And the hard sciences are physics and chemistry and all of those physical sciences. And then there's this other separate realm. And Everything from the physical sciences, yeah, you can talk about that in life and mind as well. You can talk about neurons firing, you can talk about chemical and all of that. What's not fair game is some of the things that we assume in this life and social sciences that you can't talk about in the physical science. I'd boil them down to four things: selves, making functional or useful effort. Yes, useful, good for the self effort. So it's selves making functional interpretive effort. You don't get selves in physics and chemistry. You don't get function, which by function, good or bad for someone. Yes, a religious person could say the whole of physics is good for God. That is, it pleases God. But I don't get to do that. And my grounding doesn't allow me to do that. I don't get to declare abstractions like that. And I'm arguing that actually most people working in religion, spirituality, philosophy, and science do allow themselves to do that. Where am I coming from? I come from a research program that has to explain how selves making functional interpretive effort ever emerged from physical chemistry. Everything I do, all the work I do in psychology, the stuff I do on couples relationships, on dealing with assholes, all my work in psychoproctology, it's all grounded in what for me has been a 30-year project where I've gotten to collaborate with hardcore scientists. I'm not that hardcore. I'm more of a social scientist, but I'm working with a guy who I met when he was at Harvard. He's a biologist, neuroscientist, biological anthropologist. He's a full professor at Berkeley, just went emeritus. We've been working on these questions for 30 years, close to 30 years, maybe more like 29 by now. And the questions are really simple. What are cells and how did they start? I don't get to just assume them. And what I'm saying is that if you talk to a biologist, they'll say, obviously, organisms make effort. They are motivated to make effort. They do things that are good for themselves. They struggle for their own existence. Why they do that or how to explain how they do that in molecules, physical chemistry doesn't do that, they don't really have an answer. They just assume. Naming is not explaining. I can declare that I have this thing. I have a motivation. I have an appetite. I have something like that. And I can declare it, and then I can operate as if it's one of the things I can use to explain things. Why am I going to have dinner in a little while? Because I am motivated to have dinner because I have an appetite. Okay. But what I'm saying about my work, as distinct from what goes on in most of the sciences, even, is that I don't get to simply assume those things. I have to explain motivation from the ground up. And what is the ground? It's physical chemistry. And what in particular about physical chemistry is my ground? It's the hardest ground we could ever deal with, and yet it's the right grounding. It's that everything degenerates. It's the second law of thermodynamics. You talk to anybody in the physical sciences, they'll say, yes, that is the most universal. The tendency in the universe is that for organization to become disorganized. Okay. So I have to be able to explain how my soul, which is not a material thing, but happens within souling happens within material. And what it has to do most fundamentally is it has to regenerate itself. I have to keep on regenerating myself. And no, DNA does not explain how I do that, though it's crucial to understanding the process. It doesn't explain how it's a molecule, nor does natural selection explain what it is that I'm doing that's distinct from physical chemistry. Natural selection is basically what I just described. It's a tendency for order to become disorganized. The business end of life is us struggling for our own existence. Against what? Against the tendency for everything to degenerate. So you don't have to follow any of this stuff I'm talking about in order to possibly find some wisdom in what I offer, because I'm trying to stay really pragmatic. But I will argue that I'm one of the few social scientists in the world who actually have an explanation for what a motivation or an appetite or effort really are, what a self really is, what they are in physical terms. And this comes from this collaborative work for the last 29 years or so. We could be wrong. You don't have to believe my theory about what a self is, but we've got one. And I'm saying that actually, if you look at what goes on in the religious, spiritual, philosophical, and scientific realm, you found that they actually don't have a theory for what, for example, a motivation. Naming is not explaining. I have to explain these things. I don't get to simply posit them, like, let's assume there's a God, or let's assume I've got a soul. I actually have to explain it. That's the grounding for the work that I offer. And I will argue, for personal reasons, when I first got into this work, I was looking for a better grounding because I noticed that the marketplace of supposed wisdom was grand. And it was full of uplift and people deciding, wow, this must be true because it feels true, or because the font is nice, or because it was said by Albert Einstein or whatever. I was actually trying to figure out how to shop for interpretations of what I really am in a more grounded way, trying to explain selves struggling for their own existence from a universe that, no matter where you go in it, existence of fragile things like us is unlikely. We are very unlikely, and yet here we are. So I have to be able to explain how we end up being self-regenerative universe where everything degenerates. Some stuff degenerates slowly because it's extremely durable, but that's not the case with us. We're extremely fragile, and yet here we are, keeping on every day. I have to be able to explain that. That's where I ground the wisdom that interests me, and that's what I offer up. Take it or leave it. Could be full of shit. No question about it. You cannot play in this arena without a decent chance that you will have spent your entire life barking up the wrong tree. I'm not saying my contribution is right. I am saying that is how you would ground real wisdom, is you really understand what we are from the ground up. And that's what I'm trying to offer. That's what I offer up. And see what you think of. It may not resonate for you, but that's what I offer.